Gospels. We had Luke's follow-up to the Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles. Beyond that, we've been entirely concerned with St. Paul. We have looked at all of his letters now, and we're moving into a series of letters with kind of various authors. And the first of those letters is the letter to the Hebrews. Now, I'm not going to get into the question of authorship. For a while, people thought it was St. Paul. There's been back and forth and back and forth. This is not one of those ones where everybody knew the answer until 1974, and then all of a sudden everybody threw that answer away to be new and hip and clever. We just have no idea who wrote it. Probably somebody connected to St. Paul, because it sort of kind of has his way of thinking, but definitely not Paul himself. And it was almost certainly written after Paul died. We're looking at somewhere around the early 70s A.D. This is, just to get your head, all the letters of St. Paul have been written. The book of Matthew and Mark have been written. We're probably somewhere around the same time that the Gospel according to St. Luke and the Acts of the Apostles are kind of being put together. By this time, St. John is already over in Turkey, in Asia Minor, doing his thing. And so the letter to the Hebrews kind of shows up after Peter has been crucified, after Paul has been crucified. And this is kind of explaining to those Hebrews all over, but in particular in Jerusalem, what do we do now? Where do we go from here? Hebrews has 13 chapters. The style is very, very unique. It's why it's very hard to say it's St. Paul who wrote it. And it's kind of more of a series of essays that are kind of brought together, sort of like a very, very bad ninth grade book report, where you have to write the long essay, and you got a little essay, and you just kind of stick a little joiner between it. And so it comes together sort of more like a legal brief than as something that is meant to be kind of a cohesive and complete narrative. It's very, very clear these are a series of arguments that have been used in preaching, and that these are the ones we think are going to be the most helpful for the Hebrew people to understand the transition between kind of the Judaism and the Judeo-Christianity that we're looking to move from here. The centermost theme is very much Jesus Christ is the Son of God. He is the fulfillment of the Old Covenant, and he is the great high priest. He is the good shepherd who is going to replace, by fulfilling the Jewish covenant and all the Jewish ritual and worship. He was sent by the Father to die, to rise, and to ascend gloriously. Now he reigns, having established a new covenant, which is fundamentally superior to the old. And that's something that we see all the way through. The new covenant is better than the old. It is new, it is improved, and the old covenant, sweet as it is over. It has been fulfilled in Jesus, and so there is no more discussion of whether or not you can't have bacon. Thanks be to God. That's over now. The new covenant is superior to the old, and Jesus has established a way to follow him into heaven, into an eternity that is not Sheol. It is not the place of shadows. It is not the kind of sketchy land of the dead. It is paradise. It is eternal salvation with him in a way that is basically, kind of portrayed in very much the way we think of heaven. Angels walking up, this whole kinds of myriads of angels gathered round. So the letter we're looking at is a theological analysis of the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, and then it moves forward. And so it is not an easy letter to read by any stretch of the imagination. Because so many Protestants and even some Catholics have historically been averse to the Old Testament, saying we don't really need the Old Testament, doesn't matter. Hebrews has gotten less love than it deserves. And so you see fewer real Bible studies written about Hebrews. You see fewer priests preaching about Hebrews. And the other reason you see that is because it's more complicated. The theological term we use is that Hebrews is trying to establish a cohesive Christology. a cohesive way of explaining what we believe about Jesus Christ. It's incredibly important in that way, but it is more difficult to read. And in order to set up that cohesive Christology, the letter has to really lean hard on what the Old Covenant means, on kind of some of the things that are in the back of the mind with the Old Covenant, in the back of the Hebrew mind, and then this is what the New Covenant means. And so specifically, we're going to be dealing with issues of priest, of cult, of sanctuary, and the proper worship of God, because this is all tied in with what it means to be Jewish. When we talk about the cult of Judaism, we're not talking about the cult of Scientology kind of cult. We're talking about all the rules and rituals that go into worship. Cultus is the Latin word for worship. And so when we talk about the cult of Judaism, we're talking about what are all the things that go into worship, whether we're talking about the Shabbat, or whether we're talking about the Seder, or whether we're talking about the Psalms and the Psalmody, or whether we're talking about the temple worship and exactly why you can do two turtle doves or one small goat here, and all those kinds of different rules. All of that stuff is in the back of the mind as we're reading the book of Hebrews. In regard to the law, the place that Hebrews really makes the Jews angry is that the law is fulfilled only by the Christians. Only in Christianity is the law is fulfilled. The law of Moses is superseded by the law of Jesus Christ, who is the eternal high priest, and therefore the direction of Jesus. But at this point, not really the church. That's not something that we really have a clear sense of. We're not getting from Hebrews an ecclesiology. We're getting a Christology. Who is Jesus? And like I said, even eternal rest is reframed. We're no longer talking about eternity as a place of shadows, but now we're looking at heaven, and we have a notion of heavenly rest. And so Hebrews kind of comes in 5 main sections that all breaks out. First, we have the first 2 chapters, which is really that the Son of God is great. Jesus is wonderful. He's better than the angels. He's better than pot pie. He's better than anything you could possibly imagine. Jesus is great, chapters 1 and 2. Then we have chapters 3, 4, and half of 5, where we're really getting into the question of the high priest. Jesus is great, but he's also the high priest, and that means something very specific. And this is where we get some of these arguments about the faith of Moses, the idea of the compassion of the high priest, and at the beginning of chapter 5, we get this whole notion of the priesthood of Melchizedek and why that matters when it comes to Jesus Christ. And everybody here has a sense of Melchizedek, right? We're talking about the king of Salem or the king of Jerusalem in the book of Genesis. He shows up on the scene kind of out of nowhere. We only really see him there. He brings gifts of bread and wine, and then he just disappears. And he shows up again in Hebrews, which is one of those things that us Catholics talk about Melchizedek a lot, and Protestants are like, what in the world are you going on about this guy for? But it's quite right here. I mean, the letter to the Hebrews says this guy is the archetype of what priesthood is meant to be. He is priest, prophet, and king all the way back in the book of Genesis. Now, the second half of chapter 5 all the way through the end of chapter 10, so the bulk of the book is not just about the general sense of the high priesthood, but now we're going to have the practical and spiritual and theological explanation of Jesus and what it means to be Jesus, who he is, what his priesthood means. We're going to get more deep into Melchizedek there in chapter 7. We're going to get almost a chapter and a half, or we're going to get a whole chapter on what the sacrifice of Jesus means in chapter 9. And then we're going to get a whole chapter on the question of forgiveness and what forgiveness really means. The Jews did not have a clear sense of forgiveness in a way that goes beyond emotional community. The idea that sins could be forgiven really didn't exist. I mean, you could ask God for forgiveness, sort of, by making an expiation sacrifice. But even then, you're basically dealing with more of a transactional thing. I've got red in my ledger, and so I owe the Lord, four goats, a lamb, and a big sprig of thyme, and three sprigs of mint. You have kind of a transactional sense, sort of a 1950s era notion of the confessional sense of how you're forgiven for your sins. But here in chapter 10 in particular, we get this question of what forgiveness means. And then we have 2 chapters where we have some strong examples. We're going to go back to the faith of Moses in chapter 11. We're going to see some actual theology, some thoughts about God the Father in chapter 12. And then in the end of the second half of chapter 12, we're going to get some penalties for disobedience, which are examples. They're not super helpful. It might be better even to break those out into a separate chapter, but they're in chapter 12, so they're in chapter 12. And then finally, chapter 13, we have kind of the usual concluding thoughts. So just to recap that, the first couple chapters, we have Jesus is great. The second couple chapters, we have the faithful and compassionate high priest. Then we have about 5 chapters 5 to 10, where we're getting the Christology of who Jesus is. And then we get in chapters 11 and 12 some kind of practical examples and a little bit of theology, and then we kind of tie things up. So again, the big overarching theme here is Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of the old covenant. His teaching supersedes, is better than, and replaces the old covenant. The new covenant is what we need in order to be saved, in order to be justified, and ultimately in order to go to heaven, which is not the same as Sheol, but it's fundamentally different. Again, this is a hard letter. There's no getting around it. It is the most theologically complex of the new letters in the New Testament, and it's very, very helpful, I imagine, or I find, to read the notes in your Bible, especially the Ignatius Study Bible, if you have it, carefully, because it can be very, very confusing. And we have some explanations and explications that are unique to the letter to the Hebrews. And so it can be challenging if you say, where did all of a sudden these myriads of angels gathering around the throne come from? Where did that just out of thin air? It is kind of out of thin air. It was certainly what was being taught by St. Paul, but it's not something we have documentary evidence of before we get here. So Hebrews, tough letter. Came at the after St. Paul's ministry, after St. Peter's ministry. We're going to have after this 3 or 4 more letters. We've got James and John's letters, and then we have the big monster of the book of Revelation. But Hebrews is, outside of Revelation, certainly the most complex, theologically dense writing in the New Testament. And so big challenge, but you can do it, and stick close to those notes. And if you do get confused, just realize that think of it as a series of essays being written, as opposed to a kind of a whole narrative. And also remember, there may just be some context you don't have. You really need to know the law, and you need to know the Jewish culture of worship in order to get some of these things. And if you don't have that, don't fret. That's what the notes are for, but it is non-trivial, and it's not as if you've missed something. If you go, where in the heck did that come from? There's a lot of that. You're doing okay. So Letter to the Hebrews, a wonderful book to read. I've been Father Ryan Humphries. This has been the CU Catecast. Thank you for joining us, and we'll hopefully see you again very soon.